start out this lesson by saying that Saul was an insecure leader. As king, he was more than commander-in-chief. He was the hands-on leader of the army. While he understood that he needed subordinate leaders to help defeat his nation's enemies, he disliked sharing any of the credit with those leaders. Saul demanded loyalty, and at the slightest sign of what he imagined to be disloyalty or sedition, he would unleash vengeful words and violent acts towards those who he distrusted. David is included in this need you but don't trust you, really hate you relationship. In 1 Samuel 18 and 19, Saul tries to kill David at least 12 times. Without intending to do so, David's fame grew, and his wisdom, undoubtedly a product of the Spirit, became well known. He was a man of high esteem, considered one of the best commanders around. Some leaders want good leaders around them, but Saul is not one of them. He feared those good leaders around him, and abandoning his cloak and dagger tactics, Saul now orders his servants, including Jonathan, his son, to kill David. After David had bravely slayed Goliath, Jonathan had made a covenant with David, which he certainly didn't intend to break now. But more than that covenant, Jonathan and David had a bond of brotherly love, philia love. Protecting David is more than Jonathan's duty. Jonathan delighted in David. He was truly in love with David, just as he loved himself. Now, Jonathan wants to reverse his father's orders. If he needs to, Jonathan is willing to violate that command, but he would rather reason with his father to have his father revoke the order. Jonathan first warns David, informing him of his father's orders, and he urges David to be on guard and to hide himself until he can speak to his father. Strangely, he tells David he will be meeting with his father in the very same area where David is to hide. In addition, he promises to report the outcome of his discussions to David. Jonathan's dealings with his father on behalf of David are a model of trying to seek a win-win-win solution. First, we find here an example of a friend who loves his neighbor as himself. Confronting Saul, pushing back against Saul, is dangerous business, and yet Jonathan does it. Second, Jonathan subordinates himself and his own personal interests in the throne to those of David. And third, Jonathan is a faithful and submissive son to his father. He approaches his father directly, speaks to him with respect. He speaks well of David. He appeals for David's life on one hand because of his friendship with David, but on the other hand, he appeals to his father to do what is in his own best interest, his father's own best interest. He reminds Saul that David is the most faithful and devoted servant whose actions have always benefited Saul. He also reminds his father that when David killed Goliath, Saul himself rejoiced in David's victory because it was Saul's victory as well. To be hostile against David would not be just or wise, and even worse, it would be a sin, for he would be shedding innocent blood. For the moment, Saul is persuaded by Jonathan's reasoning. He swears that as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. The fundamental, however, insecurities of Saul still exist. Like us, sometimes we can be persuaded not to act in our anger, but that decision does not change the feelings that led to the anger. Like modern Christians, Saul is still harboring distrust because of his jealousy. Thus, his promise will not last. Jonathan calls David and tells him about the meeting with his father, and the outcome then brings him back to his father's presence. For a short time, at least, things look like they used to look. But there is a thin line between trust and hate, and once that line is erased, it is hard to restore. Jonathan and David had a trusting brotherly relationship that was unconditional. Saul's relationship with David was more like a cost-benefit analysis. Saul needed David as a loyal and skillful warrior, but if David posed any threat to Saul's grasp on power, that need was outweighed by the potential harm David could bring to Saul's reign. David became a liability to the king. What we see here is a relationship that sounds a little like modern-day couples staying together because of their financial arrangements. If the finances become troublesome, the relationship becomes expendable. That's the lesson for this week. Have a great week. Bye.